So Chingy has very nicely whispered into my ear, please keep to time, so I'm going to try my best. Thank you for that introduction. I just want to quickly begin by thanking Cosmin and his team for having me here and giving me the opportunity to share a little bit of my work. I also want to begin by saying that I work at the NUS Museum, which is a university museum in Singapore. We're based inside the campus, and the project that I'm going to present today is actually part of a much broader project that I spoke about, incidentally, in Hong Kong some weeks ago, which is titled Camping and Tramping Through the Colonial Archive, the museum in Malaya, which is kind of a project that looks at how one deploys ideas within a gallery or a museum setting. Also like to have a small caveat here. I'm not an art historian. I'm a curator, and I think I hold on to that very carefully sometimes because, within the Singapore context, sometimes people become curators by accident, which includes me. Also, about this notion of determinism, I think I'm not going to elaborate on it because it's going to become, or rather, I hope it will become apparent as I present the case study, and I must admit I have not included a single gallery shot in my presentation because I don't like galleries which are empty and it's kind of clean and it's very nice and you just see the artwork and whatever. And for clarity purposes, to be honest, and I appreciate this when David did his talk yesterday, I'm going to have to do a first section because one must introduce Southeast Asia in order to talk about Southeast Asia. So it's about a little bit of context building because it kind of goes into the determinism in art and art vocabularies. I mean, how do you present a region and how do you even begin to talk about it? I'm going to read, so please forgive me, but and I have a couple of clips I want to show you as well. So here goes. Oh, how does this work? Oh, I'll just test it. Okay. We'll come back to these images. The declaration of martial law in the Philippines in 1972 by then President Ferdinand Marcos had serious ramifications in the manner in which art would be practiced and mobilized. Alice Guillermo, the leading scholar on the social realists in the Philippines, observes that from the period 1972 to 76, very few paintings and murals were done due to the stifling atmosphere of the early martial law years. In 1976, however, a loose grouping of artists held together by a social orientation was formed. Many of them also belonged to the Center for the Advancement of Young Artists, and some of the early members of the group, which called itself the Kaisahan, included Pablo Bien Santos, Edgar Fernandez, Renato Habulan, Antipas de Lotavo, with Jose Tenz Ruiz, Orlando Castillo, amongst others joining later. And whilst the Kaisahan may be regarded as the first distinct group of social realists to emerge, Guillermo also cites at least 3 other historical moments when art had been quite literally called into action. First, she discusses the role of national poet and writer Jose Rizal and his conversations with painter Juan Luna, whose painting, The Spoliarium, an image of Romans dragging out dead gladiators, an allegorical rendition of how the Spanish were treating the Philippines, won the first gold medal at the Madrid Exposition of 1884. Second was during the American colonial period and in the post-war years, especially during the period 1965 to 69, when figures such as H.R. Ocampo highlighted the ravages of war and its impact on the socially disenfranchised. The third moment, and an interesting precursor to the Kaisahan, came in 1971 when a group called the NPAA was formed. Its members talked about art for the people and resistance against the exploitation of the masses. They held seminars and anti-institution study groups at the University of the Philippines, which was becoming, and as Alice Guillermo puts it, a melting pot for artists, as they set about deconstructing the canons of art. The NPAA held Plaza Miranda as central to a lot of the activities. This is a site we will visit again and again in the course of the paper. They organized their first exhibition, an a la prima painting contest in the Plaza Miranda during the annual feast of the Black Nazarene. We'll return to the feast as well. The NPA's 1971 exhibition was titled The State of Philippine Society. It portrayed beggars and squatters as signifiers of class oppression. Furthermore, Guillermo argues that whilst the group had been dismissed by certain critics for having considered form and style as secondary to their social message, such a claim is not entirely accurate, since the NPAA constantly critiqued each other in terms of their adoption of different themes and iconographies. The group of artists, initially 7, with figures such as Marardo Arce, who was killed in 1985 by the military in Cebu, used mural, usually 3.2-meter works painted on the streets. They also painted on Indian cotton very particularly, and adapted graffiti-like gestures, suggesting the urgency of the revolution and need for change. The NPAA was also part of a much larger landscape of the mobilizing of students across Asia at the time and the increased politicization of the university public sphere, with assertive claims that art of the NPAA, and this is within quotes, was a collective activity. The NPAA, along with other mass organizations, was dissolved in 1974, so its members could disperse into the countryside and lead movements from across the country. While some members resisted this decision, the primary belief was that the revolution would come from the countryside where most of the peasants lived. And so, the Kaisahan group should also be seen in this backdrop, as they adopted a lot of the NPAA's positions. The Kaisahan group, of course, the social realists that I'll be talking about today. And in 1976, the group introduced a manifesto that focused on some key issues. Firstly, their art would be, within quotes, nationalist, they noted. We believe that national identity is not to be found in nostalgic love of the past or an idealized view of our traditions and history. It cannot be achieved by using the common symbols of our national experience without understanding the reality that lies within them. We recognize the need that national identity, if it is to be more than lip service or an excuse for personal status seeking, should be firmly located in the present social realities and on a critical assessment of our historical past so that we may trace both the roots of the realities. The group also theorized the question, art for whom? And responded by claiming art for the masses, making a sort of a parallel reference to Mao Zedong's question to the artists at the Yunnan Forum in 1942. They also spoke about alternative or oppositional art. Form, content, and style were also key. They expressed that the group would not limit itself to a particular style, although they were all primarily painters. They would adopt expressionism, surrealism, conceptual art, and installation. By the early 1980s, social realism and the group had gained significant recognition in the Philippines. And after the 1983 assassination of Ninoy Aquino, an opposition figure to the Marcos regime and exiled in USA, who kind of returned, numerous other students and youth groups emerged from the art schools, and the social realists themselves mentored some of the younger artists. One such instance was of Renato Habulan and Alfredo Esquilio Jr., two artists who also form a focal point of my paper today, was when Esquilio would visit Habulan's studio in Langin Street, which is, Langin means heaven, seeking advice and critique. As mentioned, with the assassination of Aquino, the political climate registered a marked shift, assuring the transition from Marcos to Mrs. Aquino, the widow of the assassinated leader, in 1986. As one historian of the Philippines notes, at the core of the massive protests that attended the Ninoy assassination was the surge of anti-Marcos feeling, which threatened to engulf the revolutionary impulse. A bifurcation took place in the anti-Marcos wave of protests with, on the one hand, the middle class and the sort of upper bourgeoisie, especially that fraction of the elite that had long chafed from their exclusion from Marcos's favored circle, and on the other hand, the politicized masses. And as the scholar continues, thus there were the Ugarte Field rallies in Makati for the elite, and the Plaza Miranda rallies for the masses. Plaza Miranda fronts the minor basilica of the Black Nazarene, or the Quiapo Church, one of the main churches of the city of Manila. The plaza itself acts as a numerous site for numerous interests, from free-ranging political and theological discourse to a thriving street market selling all sorts of cures, charms, and folk religious propositions. Each year on January 9th, the Plaza also witnesses the Feast of the Black Nazarene, which is a 17th century figure of Christ, and according to oral traditions, had lost its original white surface after it survived a burning galleon en route to Manila from Mexico. In 2012, the feast attracted close to 6 to 8 million devotees who traveled from across the Philippines to seek blessings and participate in the procession that lasted close to 22 hours. Nonetheless, we will return to the Plaza and the feast in a little while. But first, I must finish the story of the SR group. The new government that emerged in 1986 was of Mrs. Aquino, who claimed to represent the so-called Third Front, an oddly centrist government, unabashedly placing herself between Marcos, and the communists. There was even debate if this was then a progressive government, but soon cabinet shuffles were made and the rightist drift became increasingly apparent. It seemed the people power movement had somehow replaced one oppressive structure with another. It seems the Kaisahan group had some soul searching to do. Furthermore, as a group, there were also other challenges. How, for instance, does one execute realism? And in this case, also reinvent it, especially in the backdrop of the dominant Amar Solo school of painting, which had remained somewhat detached from discussing the so-called social condition and had its roots in a kind of an idealist academicism. Amid such debates and broader political contexts, one of the most critical themes to emerge, and this is something that has not really been unraveled, amongst certain groups of the Kaisahan, especially Renato Habulan, was their reference to the 1896 revolution and turn to figures such as Jose Rizal. Historical allegory became a potent mode of working. 19th century figures became increasingly inspirational. Habulan, for instance, had also opened a show in 1978 at the Silangan Gallery, where he evoked Sisa, a figure from Rizal's first novel, The Social Cancer, who had been driven to insanity by the loss of her sons, victims of colonial oppression. It seems Rizal was never too far away. He kept recurring amongst the urban environs that the Kaisahan firmly lodged itself in. As such, my attempt here today is not to offer insights into the burdensome category of internationalism, for it means different things in varying contexts, nor provide a defense of all things we may so easily label as the local. The hope is a lot more modest, to offer a curatorial reading about a particular site and the numerous practices that sustain it, with some reflections about the problematics that accompany contemporary curatorial practice in terms of how the museum ought to develop a method of engaging with the now, and how the museum, as a product of the quote-unquote post-colonial, at least in the Singapore context, may be unpacked. And so whilst I have offered a recounting of the Kaisahan group through the lens of kind of this nation state, probably because the context of the emergence in the 1970s demanded it as such, in the paper that I'm about to present, and I've actually not really gotten to the paper, I would also like to suggest that we understand things in the context of each individual artist's practice, and not simply position the social realist movement within easily defined or identified movements or quote-unquote structures that either allow or alienate. The broader curatorial, and if one may even call it theoretical position being presented here, is of a mode of being which posits the limits and the necessity of a self-critical modernity fated to failure, but destined to be constantly suggested as an alternative. For I would like to contend that it is precisely at this point that the interdisciplinary search is different to the idiom of either positing art as either condemned to the commodification of global capitalism and its global culture industry, or to its reduction to the national or the native by the nation state or its nationalism. Hence, the mode of curating proposition here is not to transcend, but a word that has somewhat become a little dirty these days, or a little bit difficult, but negotiate through the transformative techniques of identification within strategic locations and local moral worlds, alluding to a constantly evolving moment where the everyday becomes potentiated as a mode of working. In this spirit, and very much alluding to these complexities, is Patrick Frollès, somebody who has come up yesterday. In a yet-to-be-published paper on the iconographic complexities of the Black Nazarene of Chiappa and Plaza Miranda, he invites a mode of working, something that is central to the project at hand. And please allow me to read. The color of the Nazarene ceases to be a formalistic element, Flores notes. The chromatic code of black is hewn from a grammar that permits a community to read and speak of black as a sign of race or class, a mode of identification, a symptom of a repressed pre-colonial life world, and most of all, a type of admixture. This mestizaje, the production of the hybrid, takes us away from the nostalgia of authenticity, the naivety of syncretism, and the populism of indigenization. Rather, it trains our sights on adulteration, a productive mistranslation of pedagogy, an intimacy with form that is internalized as inalienable, and hence irresistible and irrepressible because it simply belongs. And this is where the punchline is. The blackness of Christ seems to be deliberately incongruous, indeed impossible. By impossible, we mean that it is, and he says this within quotes, not yet possible. And so black becomes a portent, a herald of something that must be foreshadowed if it is to confirm an emancipatory ideal. There is something magical about black. Semblance Presence, as an art project, is then a modest attempt at bringing some of these different energies together into a conversation within a museum of sorts. Can we have the clips? We have a couple of clips.
Papadala ko sa inyo. Ibig sabihin, hindi ko kayo iniwan. At pipili ako ng ilan sa inyo na bibigyan ko. Huwag natin sabihin na doon lang sa Jerusalem o doon lang ba sa Lahat ng naniniwala at gusto tumanggap at gusto naghahanap sa kanya, bibigyan niya.
Aking mga anak, napapanahon na upang ang Pangulo Nonoy Aquino, kung gusto maligtas ang tao sa libutan, hanapin ang Kristong Hari. Tinatawagan upang mahayag ang Holy Spirit government. Ang Kristong Hari maglalagay kung sino magiging presidente. Ako sabi si Pangulo Nonoy Aquino. Pangulo Nonoy Aquino, naikobanda na na makarong Holy Spirit government. Kung ikaw gusto pa manatiling presidente, maripayagan ka ng Kristong Hari. Kung hindi mo na kaya itong panalakad sa Pilipinas, andiyan kami. Hanap po kami ng lugar upang ang mga tao maligtas sa anuman darating kalamidad, kaguluhan, gera, bulkan, magsasabugan, lindol, mabibiyakan lupa, guguhang kabundukan. Lahat pangyayari, kalamidad, aking mga anak, walang pispira, lahat makakagulo. Ano pinag-aawayan? Ayamanan, anuman kapangyarihan. Kaya ano nila sabi ni iba na mga sa politika panay kurakot. Lahat, pati lahat, sabi, sino ba hindi kurakot? Ang nagpapayaman na walang hindi pinagpaguran, aking mga anak. Kaya makaisa-isa na kayo. Natawagan ko si Commander Ligaya, Commander Linda. Makaisa ka na, sabi mo. Pag sige sumali, mail mo ko. Andiyan kayo, andiyan mga tawang ko. Nasa buong mundo yan. Saan sila nandyan? Hudyat na lamang. Aking mga anak. Anak ko kay lahat. Anak ko sa Espiritu Santo. Ang buhay nyo irang na sa Kanya. Kung nadadama nyo ang tinig na ito, ang katastasan ng Diyos Ama, ang nanawagan sa inyo. Ang ginagawa ng tao, pinagtatawanan lang ang Kristo Hari. Nasa huwag maniwala. Marami nagpapanggap ng Kristo. Marami nagpapanggap. Nandito binusya siya ng asin.
Pero pagka nagtitinda tayo, nagdadasal tayo, kasama natin din sa pagdadasal. Kasama natin din sa pag-aawit. Ang pagdadasal ng kanyang buhay, kasama tayo sa
Ang Panginoong Mariano, puno ka ng grasya. Ang Panginoong Diyos, pagod kang pinagpala sa mga pinagpala kong Panginoong Sus na sa kayo.
Santa Maria, ina ng Diyos, ipanalangin mo kami magkasalanan. Ngayon at kung kami mamamatayan.
In his second novel, El Filibusterismo, Jose Rizal's characters stroll through the Chiappa Fair and observe the long rows of booths, brilliant with tinsel and gauds, exposed to views clusters of balls, mass strung by the eyes, tin toys, trains, carts, mechanical horses, carriages, pine nativities, dolls both foreign and domestic, the former red and smiling, the latter sad and pensive, resting like little ladies beside gigantic children. Chiappa's figures, it appears, strewn, sprawling, and archetypal, invoke visions, tensions, and debate amongst Rizal's characters at about what may constitute reverence and where art seems to fit within all of this. Listening to the people at the fair, Rizal's characters, two journalists and a parish priest, ponder, and I quote him here, "Many of our visitors were displeased with the exhibition. They talked of rules of art. They sought proportion. One said that this figure did not have 7 heads and that the face lacked a nose. Others said if they were muscular that they could not be Indios. Still others remarked that it was not sculpture but mere carpentry." As elsewhere, ceaseless modernist energies seem to have overwhelmed. The Chiappa carnivalesque and incongruent curation of bodies and knowledge would need to traverse steady incantations of the folk, wrestle pathologies of the self, and render any attempt at categorization problematic. In the event, and as Rizal's text spares nothing in Chiappa, the reappearance and persistence of figures bearing signs of Christian saints alongside anitos, scapulars vis-a-vis antings, which are kind of talismans, liturgical songs invoking spirits of potency, fertility, and death reflect a break, momentary lapse, or slippage in the colonial condition of absolute submission. As they stroll, Rizal's characters approach a booth surrounded by sightseers who quickly clear out of the way. It was a shop of little wooden figures of local manufacture, representing in all shapes and sizes the costumes, races, and occupations of the country. Indios, Spaniards, Chinese, mestizos, friars, clergymen, government clerks, students, soldiers, and so on. This fascination with detail, rehearsed in a language economy of immense meticulousness, leads to another observation. And I quote here again. Whether the artist had more affection for the priests, the folds of whose habits were better suited to their aesthetic purposes, or whether the friars holding such an important place in Philippine life engaged the attention of the sculptor more, the fact was that, for one cause or another, images of them abounded. Well turned and finished, representing them in the sublimest moments of their lives, the opposite of what is done in Europe, where they are pictured as sleeping on casks of wine, playing cards, emptying tankards, rousing themselves to gaiety, or patting the cheeks of a buxom girl. Reading, we cringe. Chiappa provokes nausea, curiosity, bewilderment, but also an obsession with its visually arresting tapestries, and this obsessive impulse to understand why Rizal would have appeared at this site. What does this stroll through Chiappa signify? What does this suggest about the social consciousness of this time? In the concluding paragraphs, an uneasy resolution is reached. And this is the conversation that ensues again. Each added his spoonful of criticism, until Padre Camorra, the parish priest, not to be outdone, ventured to ask for at least 30 legs for each doll, because if the others wanted noses, couldn't he require feet? So they fell to discussing whether the Indio had or had not any aptitude for sculpture, and whether it would be advisable to encourage that art, until there arose a general dispute, which had cut short Don Custodio, the journalist's declaration that the Indios had the aptitude, but they should devote themselves exclusively to the manufacture of saints. Don Custodio's statement introduces a miscellany of dilemmas. It opens the scene to a sort of a double disturbance, or arousal of profound skepticism about how to contemplate the technologies of art making and their representations in museum contexts today. Artist curatorial discussions began in late 2010 when Renato Habulan and Alfredo Ischilio expressed interest in collaborating with the NUS Museum in a project that would broadly unravel how people venerate objects of faith and the kinds of potential art holes in enacting a genealogy of sorts, in engaging the historical basis of such rituals. Emerging as it does on the fault lines between center and periphery, resistance and submission, rationalism and non-rationalism, I refrain from using the word irrationalism, already integral concerns of their respective art practices, both artists wanted to show the incongruous relationship between objects, relics, religious paraphernalia, and the environment of Chiappa Church, where the faithful would gather and practice their beliefs like faith healing, palm reading, and sell whatever venerated concoctions they had prepared. Responding partly to the problematics and self-reflexive manner in which the Sufi and the bearded man, remembering a kramat in Singapore, was or had been curated, an exhibition which engages the material remains of a kramat, which is literally a shrine, belonging to a 19th century Sufi traveler from Baghdad, had been curated, the artists went further to suggest and invite curatorial collaboration by noting in their proposal. The exhibition will try to strengthen the archival orientation of the curatorial aspect by including documentation, videos, and print of the entire process. Keeping in view that this was an art project, the artists insisted that there would not be any escape into some kind of ethnographic empiricism, but engage the site of Chiappa for its contradictions, confusions, and at times emphatically unsystematic relations. A Rizalian project, if there ever was such a thing, where the conscious use of the word our would precisely resist the assumptions that sees the representational world as transparent. Rather, the artist and later the curatorial method would insist that the facticity of this project would reside in the ability to tell its audiences not what society or religiosity or the subjects are like, but what these complex matrices look like to them. In a post-exhibition interview, for instance, Renato Habulan reflected, "We, referring to Ischilio and himself, tested this collaboration through our strolls in Chiappa, and instantly things started fitting. In fact, if you recall, that is when you, referring to me, suggested this distinction between the center and periphery, because that is exactly the relationship we want to unravel here, exclamation mark. The church was an institution and the people around it, the object, the commerce, the people, the bystander. But there is something more than the center periphery at play here too. For instance, when we went to Manglauro's house, Manglaro is the figure you saw earlier, and everything went fine, even if all the rituals are very local, we were able to understand them. Even if the rituals are highly specific, we were able to respect them. Even now, we continuously document Manglauro and his community. We continuously deliberate and think about the process where the curatorial and artistic converge. The final test, you use the word test, is the exhibition in the museum itself. We crossed everything from documentation to installation to performance, and we had to keep handling Chiappa and its figures through it all. We will need to keep doing this. Let me continue with my paper. Habulan's claim of social ease appears within the domain of registering an attempt at accessing the kind of Filipinos who represent not aberrations, but a lived reality of a general condition potentiated through the politics of a particular site. The use of the expression "we will need to keep doing this" characterizes by analogy the approach directed towards the treatment of their subjects, but also both artists' self-identification and observers who are constantly willing to invite and actively solicit collaborations. Amidst the chaos that remains oddly certain is that although it is not an impossible task to understand the painlessly coercive uniformities that attempt at understanding collective expressions, the mute pain of Habulan's observations resides in acknowledging the materiality, underlying power and cosmological expressions of popular culture or folk figures, who have been too easily, at times, I think, banished as myths, falsehoods, or superstitions. Carefully then, echoing Reynaldo Ileto, a very foremost historian of Philippines. I can't believe I have to say that. And his observations about the ability to engage lesser heard narratives. And yet, and this is Ileto saying, and yet I would argue that the main features of a powerful narrative of the past are contained in myth. The kind of history is even alive even today, particularly among those who live on the fringes of urban society, a significant point of reference for the current project at hand. In the lead up to the exhibition, as its curatorial method was still being deliberated over, Eschilio handed over hundreds of photographs which he had accumulated in a shoebox, aptly labeled Chiappa Nazareno Pics. Looking more closely at its contents, the Nazareno Box, if I may even call it that, presented an odd theoretical and methodological approach to the yearly feast of the Black Nazarene, and one particular figure, i.e. Manglaro, a mystic both artists and in particular Eschilio had been observing in and around Plaza Miranda since the 1980s. Mostly undated, the photographs had been organized in a contradictory and persistently unsystematic manner. Upon querying, Eschilio and Habulan suggested that these fragments of Chiappa offered a more productive response to the general messiness of the site itself. The box, it seems, was a container where numerous agencies converged. And rather than offering a simple breakdown between Chiappa, Manglaro, Plaza Miranda, and the larger socio-political events, such as the Feast of the Black Nazarene, this accumulation and subsequent transfer of materials from artist to curator ought to be seen working within understanding of the site as inseparable from the manner in which they had approached the current project. Since we are a little running short of time, I am going to talk about a little bit here. And when Eschilio talks about this notion of how he engages with his subject, he says here, he does not even try to baptize us, Eschilio notes. There is no compulsion. He was letting us in, first as visitors, but also because he appreciates the attention. I have painted him 13 times. He has painted Manglaro, this figure, 13 times. For instance, there is always this recurring figure of Veronica in Renaissance paintings. And he's trying to sort of rationalize, why does he keep painting this man? Veronica is depicted holding a cloth, and the face of Jesus is transferred to the cloth. The image is so clear, it's not possible. But it's a deliberate attempt at portraying Veronica because Veronica means to engage through image. So for me, Veronica is there in the painting because Veronica becomes an iconographer of Christ. She holds the image of Christ because he will not be present physically, but the image remains. So I realized that maybe I have become the Veronica of Manglaro, you see? Whilst the artists had their own turning points, the curatorial turn occurred with the realization that from the start there was something inherently unstable about the project. characterized by tensions across the productive chaos that is Chiappa, the range of materials that the artists were hoping to engage with, and the kinds of curatorial and advisory perspectives of those involved. There's also a quotation by Renato Habulan when he talks about this notion where since the 80s he was photographing and taking photographs, but he never actually approached Maglauro until we engaged in this kind of project where they started talking to him. So let me just get into my last section. I'll quickly wrap up. So these are some images from the shoebox. This is in the gallery itself when Ischilio, on the day of the opening, did this performance. It was called The Passionists, where he went around selling this idea of some kind of a cult, and people were free to accept or not. As a scenography of spaces and bodies, the plaza is often described by relations of proximity between its elements. Formally, one may define these relations as grids, pavilions, courts, steps of different scale and texture, suggesting an inexhaustible list of changing inflections. The whole of it can be taken in with a stroll that could last a few minutes or may require days as every corner is unraveled, and the results of it many imaginaries or imaginaires assembled into a matrix. It is, and I'm going to go back a little bit to Geoffrey Bawa, the Sri Lankan architect, it is a civilizing wilderness that demands a sort of regard that Michel Foucault describes as the fatal intersection between time and space. Extending this theoretical trope, it may indeed be plausible to recognize on the one hand that the plaza is neither natural nor an innovation, for it has had a presence in both formerly colonized and metropolitan centers. And on the other hand, as it comes to form part of our concern, our theory, our retinal systems, and our ability to generate so-called things, it also finds an odd similarity with the site of the museum or the gallery itself. For Semblance presence, the disappearance of the plaza into the museum, however, also raises questions about the functions of social interaction, and if indeed it can or ought to be converted into a muse. What kind of artist curatorial propositions could be made about translating Chiappa into a museum as a helter-skelter rather than an iron cage? Could the gallery continuously oscillate from impressionistic detail to abstraction and back again? As an artist curatorial proposition, as a play between Rizal's the Chiappa Fair and artworks produced by the artists, it attempted to connect both artists and their materials to not just as something being observed, but also to the conditions of their observations, where the very act of observation becomes an end that at once implicates but also detaches. And so the plaza, which in some ways has now become the museum, also forewarns that this project ought to enable some kind of a counter-intuition. And I'm finishing up, just 2 minutes. To engage that notion of modernity that is not afraid to fail, but also resist unifying systems that attempt to connect Chiappa into a whole for its audiences. It attempts to abolish received distinctions, a critical ontology, proposing a sort of an ontology of the everyday, a representational modern, and everything in that way then can be held suspect, you see. The style of living and the poetics we often take for granted. It may as well be regarded as a form of montage. This is the tempest, and the materialism of history is being propelled out of control. This is dizzying, and these are words from Habulan. This is dizzying, breaking down, discharging voices in the face of an endless proliferation of things, the semblance of an ecology amidst the presence of detritus. And so, recalling the quotation by Patrick Flores on the almost impossibility of the Black Nazarene, where it was cautioned to speak of forms is to move into a field of aesthetics and to gaze upon society as a last analysis is by itself a work of art. The struggle here is to ascertain if culture, and in particular what is perceived around Chiappa, ought to be understood as a unity of collective presentation, or whether the different incongruities are an essential component of the encounter. Amidst the eerie emergence of Rizal and the tight balancing between Habulan, Ischilio, and the primary collaborator, Maglauro, perhaps we ought to be reminded of the most poetic of utterances by Ben Zaib, the audacious journalist from Rizal's El Filibusterismo. And this is how the chapter ends. you'll see, and this is conceptual art, no? In 19th century. You'll see that it's all a question of mirrors, he said. Because you see, again he plunged into a long demonstration. And as he had no mirrors at hand to discredit his theory, he tangled himself up in all kinds of blunders and wound up by not knowing himself what he was saying. In short, you'll see how it's all a question of optics. Thank you. Do we have like 2 minutes or 3 minutes? There's a clip, because this is an interesting reflection of Habula and talking about the social realist project. And it's quite ironic, you see, because it's not resolved. And okay. Please play it.
Having that struggle to really reveal what is truly spiritual. And that's the one problem that is being presented here.
And reveal what is also perhaps oddly a social reality. Is that fair to say? Is it a certain reality? I mean, you know, Manglaro's economic poverty as well in some ways. Is it meant to reveal this? Is that something that occurred to you while you were working on it?
Well, the poverty is a choice for him, because like what Serato said, he chose that kind of life, and that he was rich before. So I think the poverty is just well, the way I see it is that I still see, what I see here is not, you know, the physical poverty, but the humility that belongs to his life. It's his life. It's a choice. And so the social concern here is that it can be, you know, transcendent, because it also belongs to the surface. Whatever reality we are in, this will all pass. And I think that's the image of Manglaro. Everything will pass.
Well, Sato, then let me ask you a question. In some ways, with this exhibition and the process that you went through, I mean, yes, as a collaboration, but personally as well, what would you think, or what would you say about social realism now as a project?
Okay.
How it's changed? And,
Okay. Then definitely there's a change, but it does not change on the philosophy of my aspiration that eventually the people from below will rise up. So I look at.
Anybody got any quick questions? Just remember to or comments for the floor.
A quick question on reception in Singapore, because you talked about reception when the artists were testing it in Manila, but how? What sort of reactions did you get at the NUS Museum?
I think one of the ways, we're not very sure what kind of a reaction it was, but because there is a certain idea of the Philippines that operates in Singapore, you see. And of course, it's very much at times a kind of an idea that even, I mean, there might be connections here with Hong Kong, you know, there's a certain idea, which is kind of, yeah. The way that we mediated this curatorially was with the introduction of Rizal's chapter into the exhibition space itself. So then there was this kind of a certain context that people could enter it. It was still quite ambiguous, but we attempted to mediate it as such. So the reception in many ways was sort of to disrupt this idea of kind of a, yeah, I'm not sure how one may call it. I resist from using the word social reality, because that's what, it was never about social reality. It was about the potentials of art in that sense.
Any other comments or questions? Last one. Okay, thank you. And we will take a 5 minutes recess and be back.